Hello, my name is Keisha Gilliard. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I'm going to be presenting Black history as queer history, providing mirrors for our youth. This is a content warning for this presentation. There are references to suicides, some disturbing pictures. There are some warnings before that comes, and some other potentially information. Also, this is a production from Broward County Public Schools. If you would like to have more information, you can always email me about that. My email is at the bottom of the screen as well as the end of the presentation. Throughout this presentation, there are references to some famous LGBTQ people throughout history. So at the bottom right-hand corner here, this is Janet Mock. She's a Black and Hawaiian transgender woman. She's a writer. She was a writer on the show Pose. So today we're going to go over who is Blake Brockington. 2, what do all those letters mean? A question I get asked a lot. 3, history versus historical memory. 4, Black history is LGBTQ history. 5, what is at stake for LGBTQ plus Black and Afro-Caribbean youth? And affirming the experiences of LGBTQ plus Black and Afro-Caribbean youth. The bottom of your screen is Sylvester, disco singer, gender bending, gender non-conforming disco singer who showed up in all of his truth. Blake Brockington was a Black transgender teen. This is a quote from him. "My family feels like this is a decision I made. They think you're already Black. Why would you want to draw more attention to yourself? But it's not a decision. It is who I am. I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy." So Blake Brockington was voted prom king at his high school in North Carolina. He was the first trans person to be voted prom king in the state of North Carolina a few years ago. So it was a really big deal. He made national headlines. That was good and bad for him. He got a lot of congratulatory news from people around the world, even, but he also got a lot of threats, unfortunately, as a result of him now becoming popularized in the news. So again, this is Blake Brockington on the left, and this is Nigel Shelby on the right. Nigel Shelby was a Black queer teen. He came out to his mom as gay as a teenager. She was very accepting and loving. Unfortunately, according to her claims, and I believe there's still an open investigation about this, when he took his life, he was being told by some of the administrators at his school that being gay was a choice, and he may want to reconsider. There were also other claims of him not making the right choice and decision and so on and so forth. So even though he was born into a very supportive Black family, unfortunately, he still took his life because of what he was enduring at school at the hands of adults and students, and a lot of bullying from students. This is the gender unicorn. So what do all these letters mean? Hopefully this will be a good source for you. I got this from Tesser, Trans Student Educational Resources. The website is in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture. So it's a website created by 2 trans youth who decided there needed to be more transgender youth inclusive resources on the internet. So they created their own, which is great and admirable. So at the top, we have gender identity. Gender identity is who you think you are. It's quite literally how you identify. Everyone has a gender identity, even people who don't identify with any gender, right? That is their identity, that they are neither male, female, nothing else. So it is denoted by this rainbow here in the picture inside the thought bubble from the unicorn. So essentially, gender identity is who you are thinking in your head that you are, right? That exists on a spectrum or a scale. Some people say a continuum of gender. Some people's experience can be either 0% woman, 50% woman, or 100% woman. Some people's gender experience is of man. Some people's gender experience is another gender altogether. It's generally called non-binary in English, but there are many other words and many other cultures for that, and we're going to go over that later. Next step is gender expression, denoted by this green dot. So notice that the green dot is on the outside of the unicorn. So gender expression is how you may look, right, to yourself and to others. And sometimes that can come in conflict, right? So if you think I look very feminine today, and then you go into society and someone says, oh, you look like a man, that might mess you up a little bit. But that just proves that gender expression has no universal truth around it, right? Gender expression varies from culture to culture and the eye of the beholder. So things that I may consider masculine in my Americanized opinion may not be considered masculine in other societies, and so on and so forth. So gender expression also exists on a spectrum or a continuum. You can be more or less feminine, more or less masculine, more or less androgynous, or something else. Next step down is sex assigned at birth. So sex assigned at birth varies as well. Sex assigned at birth is not binary, just like gender identity and gender expression is not binary, meaning a system of two. Sex assigned at birth can be male, female, or intersex. Biological sex is made up of many different variables, not just the organs between your legs. You do have external genitalia. You also have internal sex organs. You have chromosomes. You have hormones. Primary, secondary sex characteristics, abound. There are many different things that make up biological sex. For many people, when you're born, they look at your external genitalia and they decide to put you into female or male. But there are some babies who are born with ambiguous genitalia. And there's usually a lot of problems that come with that, not because there's anything wrong with the child, but because there's something wrong with the way we don't allow people to figure out their gender or develop their own gender when they're born. So we are assigned a sex at birth. And whether or not you agree with that sex, we'll go over what that looks like on the next slide. So please also understand that these arrows are separating these sections because they are separate and distinct. So while you have gender identity, you have gender expression, you have biological sex, they are not to be confused or conflated, and they do not influence each other. And next step down, something that's also confused a lot with gender expression is physical and emotional attraction, right? So physical attraction may be who you want to kiss or hug, and emotional attraction is like a romantic attraction, who you want to be in a relationship with and what that relationship would look like. All right, so that's the gender unicorn. These are the four separate and distinct categories, well, five technically, separate and distinct categories that are usually in enumerated protections in non-discrimination policies, right? So that's the difference between gender identity, gender expression, biological sex or sex assigned at birth, physical attraction, and emotional attraction. So vocabulary, cisgender, you may have heard that word before. Cis, C-I-S, actually means to be on the same side of. It's a chemistry term when isomers are on the same side. So a person who is cisgender, their gender identity is on the same side as when they were born. So whatever sex they were assigned at birth, if you were born assigned female at birth, you still agree that you are female for the rest of your life, you are cisgender. So it's a person whose gender identity has not changed throughout life. Cisgender exists on a spectrum, just like transgender identity exists on a spectrum. So conversely, transgender, trans means to change, to move, right? So a trans person's gender identity has moved, has shifted at some point in life. So the sex they were assigned at birth may not be how they identify later on in life. So transgender is an umbrella term describing anyone whose experience of gender is different from the way that they were assigned at birth. Non-binary, again, that's an English word. There are many different words for people who are not just male or not just female in many different societies. We're going to touch on them a little bit later on. And non-binary just means I am not just man or just woman. It's an entire spectrum of identities outside of male and female. All right. Sexual orientation vocabulary. So notice that these are two different slides, right? Gender and orientation. So we don't want to conflate those. And not all orientations are sexual because asexual people exist. Some orientations are just emotional or romantic. So we have LGB. Most people know what those are. So we'll start at queer. I always use queer with a disclaimer. There are a lot of people who are uncomfortable with the word queer, and that's completely valid. It absolutely was and still is a slur, depending on how you use it. But there are younger people generally who kind of reclaim the word to give it power within that in group. And sometimes that's still not okay for out group people to use it. So the general rule of thumb is if someone is comfortable being called queer, then you can use it. If someone says, please don't call me queer, then obviously don't use it. But if they are using queer, queer is the entire spectrum of orientations outside of heterosexuality. So almost like a scale from a little bit, I kind of think I really like the same gender. I want to kind of explore that all the way to I exclusively date members of the same gender and everything in between. The entire spectrum is queer. Questioning is a completely valid thing. A lot of young people especially question, and no matter where they come out on the other side of that, it's completely normal and healthy for them to question their gender, their orientation, so on and so forth, and for us as adults to give them that room to explore. What we don't want to do is say things like, you're confused, right? because a lot of young people don't have the gender unicorn, right, to figure out who they are, who they like, what they prefer. So we have to keep that in mind. Asexual. So that's for some people who do not experience sexual attraction or they just don't experience it for certain people. Asexual is also a large spectrum that falls. There are a lot of things that fall under the asexual spectrum for many people. So sometimes asexual people can be sexual, sometimes it depends, sometimes they're not sexual at all, and so on and so forth. It's a scale, as many of these are. And pansexual. So while bisexual is for people who are attracted to two or more genders, generally genders like their own and different from their own. Pansexual people are people who generally say, I'm attracted to a person's spirit or a person's being or a person's personality. If we vibe, then we vibe. And it doesn't really matter what their gender is, or their gender comes secondary. So that's the general difference between pansexual and bisexual. But generally, bisexual and pansexual people date two or more people. But again, I included that small difference. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about intersectionality. So intersectionality is a term coined by Dr. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw. It's a sociological theory that outlines how a person may face multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and systemic oppression simultaneously, depending on their race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, age, etc. There are many different things we can comma that all the way out. So this is an illustration of what intersectionality looks like for the individual, right? So it is an analysis tool to understand how a person cannot be one thing, right? You can't just be Black, right? At the same time that you are Black, you are X, Y, Z, F, G, all the letters, right? I actually added some at the top of this illustration. I added immigration status, size, the list goes on, especially here in South Florida, where immigration status is very important. And I also noticed that fat phobia and size politics wasn't included here. So you could have education, sexuality, ability, age, gender, so on and so forth. All of these identities we experience simultaneously. But for some of these identities, some of us experience privilege, while in other identities, some of us experience disadvantages in the same society, right? So we're walking together down the same street, but we're not experiencing the same things as we walk together, because some of these identities give you privilege, like people who hold law degrees, for example, while some of these give you disadvantages, like people who didn't finish middle school or high school, for example. And we know that there are certain privileges that people who have high education get to have. But also, depending on your race and class and so on and so forth, that's going to affect your ability to have privileges, even if you are educated, right? So it's a sticky mess, but hopefully that will help us understand. So to root us and to ground us in today's presentation, we're going to be talking specifically about how race intersects with sexuality, orientation, and gender. So privilege, something that we mentioned before. So privilege here, as it is described, unearned, unasked for, and often invisible benefits and advantages that are readily available to dominant identity groups. So everyone has privilege in one way or another. And it's something that I have to talk a lot about as I do this work about race, gender, and orientation. I oftentimes have to call white LGBTQ people in and say, hey, that thing you said was kind of racist. You should work on that. I even had a white gay man tell me that he couldn't be racist because he's gay. But of course, that's not how that works, right? And I, at the same time, have to call in a lot of white cisgender heterosexual or Black cisgender heterosexual people and say, hey, that thing that you said was kind of homophobic or kind of transphobic. Let me explain how. And sometimes I still get hostility from that group as well, because it's like, I'm dealing with oppression. Why are you telling me that I'm capable even of oppressing someone else? Right. So it's a conversation that has to be had. And the best way to understand oppressive systems is not only to educate yourself about those oppressive systems, but also about your privileges and how you move about in the world. So, what is history? According to Google, the study of past events, particularly in human affairs, and the whole series of past events connected with someone or something. All right, so this is C. Riley Snorton. C. Riley Snorton wrote the book Black on Both Sides about the experiences of Black trans people throughout history. But it's not exactly what you might think. It's an excellent book. I suggest it. What is historical memory? Often expressed as collective memory or social memory or the politics of memory. Basically, historic memory is how people in a society decide what history will look like, right? So history is kind of what actually happened, while historical memory is what we want to paint the picture of what happened. One example would be George Washington, for example, was not technically the first president of the United States. There were 7 or 8 individuals who were president before him while we were still trying to figure out what our country was going to look like. While we were still drafting our Constitution and all of these things, we still needed someone to quote unquote lead the country. And George Washington fit in that he was kind of this person who grew up poor and then became a war general. And that was very heroic and patriotic. And people felt like we could really get around that. So we decided to make to write George Washington as the first president of the United States, regardless of the fact that there were people who came before him who were the technical presidents of the United States. You can Google that fact. I promise I didn't make it up, but that is what historical memory is, right? So historical memory is George Washington is president, but history says something a little bit different. In the bottom right-hand corner here, you have someone who just won the Pulitzer for drama and poetry. Just a moment. That is C. Riley Snorton. I believe I actually skipped a boxer as well. Let me go back. Right. So this boxer, Emile Alphonse Griffith, he was a gay boxer in the Virgin Islands. I believe he's still living. Yeah, so he's a part of Black LGBTQ history. So when we consider history, when we consider historical memory, where are these pictures included? All right. So where are those pictures? I pulled all those pictures off of various areas in social media, the recesses of Google, as best as I could find as I was looking for historical depictions of Black LGBTQ people throughout history. All right. So we know that they were there, right? We know that they existed. I mean, these people were looking straight at the camera, right? We know that they were proud. They wanted people to know. They were celebratory. Many of them were dancing and smiling and loving and getting married, right? So we know they were there. But when you think about Black LGBTQ people throughout history, when I've asked people, they struggle to name even 2 or 3 Black people, especially from like that era, that black and white era, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Right. So these are some famous Black people who are supportive of their LGBTQ children. And we have Magic Johnson and his son EJ. And he said he really struggled at first, but he got it together because he realized that he cherished his relationship with his son, and that if he continued to have a problem, then his relationship with his son would deteriorate rapidly. We also have Marlon Wayans, who's very proud of his gay daughter. He actually posted about her recently on social media, and he got a lot of backlash about that. People were like, "Oh, you shouldn't be proud of her being gay. What's wrong with you?" And he said, "Go hate your own kid. I love my kid, and I'm going to continue to love my kid." It's kind of hilarious. This is Sade. Her son is transgender. He's very public about his transition, and he's always very thankful and appreciative of his mom, who has been there the entire time throughout his experiences, throughout his surgeries, throughout the backlash that he received in the media. So thank goodness for that. And of course, we have Dwayne Wade and his daughter and his wife being very supportive of their child, who recently was awarded because of her bravery. She actually designed this dress because this is the non binary flag at the bottom here. So I wanted to make sure that people understood that she designed all of their outfits to look like the non binary flag, or the genderqueer flag, if you will. In the bottom here is Josephine Baker, famous Black model. She was rumored to have had an affair with Frida Kahlo, the Mexican painter. So, when have historians considered the human affairs, as Google describes it, related to Black and Afro-Caribbean people historically significant or archival worthy, right? So when has that happened throughout history? It's kind of rhetorical since I'm recording this. In the bottom here, we have Little Nas X. He's probably the youngest person in this presentation, but I thought, hey, why not? Since we're talking about youth. And of course, he's openly gay. Bonus question related to the previous question. How often has Black and Afro-Caribbean history been interpreted through the white gaze and ultimately revised? Right? So when we talk about the gaze is not just looking at something. And there are a lot of historians and scholars who have talked about what that gaze means, but it introduces a power dynamic. Jonathan Schroeder says, to gaze implies more than to look at. It signifies a psychological relationship to power in which the gazer is superior to the object of the gaze. And of course, all things that you're gazing at can only be interpreted through your understanding of your power over the subject, right? So the gaze is like a jury on trial judging someone else, right? We're not equal in that, right? Someone's life is in danger and you're just here, and whatever happens to that person, you're gonna live and go on about your life, right? So that's kind of what the gaze is. And when we talk about the white gaze, we defined it here, the tendency of all works, publications, experiences to be interpreted through the white dominant cultural norms and explained in the same terms. And it's not just white people who have this gaze. Any kind of social dynamic, we have this. We have the colonial gaze. We have male gaze, right? When there's a power imbalance, you can only understand things through your terms. And you expect everything to make sense through your understanding of the world. This is why a lot of gay people get asked things like, which one is the man in the relationship? And you're just like, but these are two women. Like, neither one is the man. That makes no sense, right? But of course, that's what the gaze does. When you're interpreting someone through your understanding of the world and forcing them to make sense based on your understanding of the world. At the bottom here, we have Angie Extravaganza. She's featured in the documentary Paris is Burning. She's kind of like the voguing queen back in the day, Afro Latina. So this is one of the things that happened. So this was a book that was written about Harlem, and of course you can see the title of the book, and the entire book is kind of written incredulously, like, "Oh my gosh, did you know Black people could read?" Instead of just saying the Harlem Renaissance is a beautiful, powerful, wonderful thing, this is the title that the book was given. At the bottom right hand screen here is the former Prime Minister of Haiti, who I've been told was not in the closet, but was not out of the closet, kind of in between, but she's definitely a queer woman. Her name is Michelle Pierre Louis. This is another example. So this is a recent headline, late last year, 2019. Woman sets her hair on fire, NYC subway. So most Black people know that she is not setting her hair on fire, right? And this also goes to like the lack of journalists getting positions, the lack of Black journalists getting positions where decisions are made, right? Or where they're trying to tell you your headline doesn't make sense, but they're ignored, right? But of course, we know that she's not lighting her hair on fire. We know exactly what she's doing. But when things are being interpreted through the white gaze, this is what tends to happen. So now you've made an incorrect statement about what this woman's intentions are, even though to you, you might be like, wow, I'm looking at her and I know she's lighting her hair on fire. That's not exactly what's happening. So we have to consider how that happened throughout history and how that happened to erase, quote unquote, those pictures that we looked at before of these Black, queer, and trans people living their best lives many years ago. And respectability also bleeds into this, right? We're going to talk about that soon. This is Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday was rumored to have several girlfriends back in her day. So, some examples of historical happenings. We have here at the top Lucy Hicks Anderson. She lived from 1886 to 1954. She was a Black transgender woman who was living out in the West. She was said to be like the life of the party. She was a madam. She used to make things happen. She had like all these business people who wanted to have dealings with her because she threw the best parties, and she was well respected throughout her community, even though she was a Black trans woman. She told her parents when she was a very, very young girl that she was a girl, even though she was assigned male at birth. Her parents took her to the doctor. The doctor was like, well, she seems convinced, so you might as well go with it. So her parents went with it. So since she was very, very young, in the 1800s, she has been living her life as a girl, and she's very proud of who she was. Unfortunately, she was arrested many times for quote unquote cross dressing or whatever they called that back in the day. And she also was put into jail because she was married to um, a soldier and she was using some of his GI money. And they said their marriage was illegitimate because she was not really a woman. But she has a fascinating history, and her history predates that of Christine Jorgenstein. Now, Christine Jorgenstein was the first transgender woman to undergo bottom surgery to get a vaginoplasty. From 1926 to 1989, she lived. So as you can see, I mean, there was a huge jump in the years between these two individuals. But when people think about like the first transgender woman, they often think about Christine Jorgenstein. It is true that she is most famous because she had the surgery, right? And the movie The Danish Woman is about her. But Lucy Hicks Anderson also had a thriving history and that was well documented. So we have to keep that in mind. This is Althea Garrison. Althea Garrison was voted into the Massachusetts House of Representatives in the early 1990s, and she is also a Black transgender woman. She ran on the Republican ticket and she won. She's now independent, I believe. But many people don't know her history, her experience. On the other side is Danica Rome. Danica Rome is also a transgender woman. And she was voted to the North Carolina House of Delegates about in 2018, I believe it was. And people do not know a lot about Althea Garrison. I understand that. But people do know who Danica Rome is. And when she came out, people said, oh, Danica Rome is the first transgender woman, voted to the House within our state and history, and this is a big deal. But she wasn't. Althea was first. We have the Stonewall movie that came out in 2015. And the Stonewall riots were a huge occurrence as far as gay rights were concerned. It was them fighting back against police brutality. And that's going to come up a lot here, right? So, police brutality is something that impacts Black, queer, and trans people on an enormous scale. And back in 1969, a lot of queer and trans people said, no more, we're not doing this. They started fighting back against the cops, and that is what kind of spurred a large gay rights movement. So when the Stonewall movie came out, the director didn't use any of the stories of some of the most famous people as a part of the Stonewall riots who were Black and brown. He instead just made up a mythological character, a young white boy who didn't exist, instead of interviewing like people who are still alive that were a part of the Stonewall riots, like Miss Major on the left here. She's still alive, still living in California right now to this day. There's a wonderful documentary about her. It was available on Hulu. I don't know if it still is, but it's called Major. And she does work on getting Black and brown trans people, but trans people in general, out of incarceration because of the terrible experiences that she had as a Black trans woman who was imprisoned on Rikers. Right, and Rikers comes up a lot when we think about like the terrorism of Black people. And we saw that in the Central Park Five or the Exonerated Five. We saw that in the Kalief Browder story, right? So we have to consider that this intersection of race means that there is police violence and incarceration violence throughout both histories. So again, we have Stonewall, where we included the history of someone who did not exist and erased a lot of the Black and brown people who did still exist and are still alive as a part of the Stonewall riots. These are two books that were written to basically fight back against some of the histories that said that Black people were not gay in Africa, right? So homosexuality is not un-African is the subtitle for this book. So you know that the writer, the author of this book, heard that far too many times. Boy wives and female husbands, studies in African homosexualities. So these are not just homosexualities, these were actually gendered terms. So this is like trans people and non-binary people. That's the words that we would use in English nowadays. Back in the day, they were called boy wives and female husbands. And this is something that happened in many different countries in the continent of Africa, not just one area or one tribe, but many different tribes. Because as we know, as we should know, being queer or trans is not a choice. It's a natural part of the human experience. And therefore, it's often found in all societies. I had a colleague who once argued with me that there were no gay people in Haiti. He was Haitian himself, and I'm not Haitian. And I was like, there are definitely gay people in Haiti, but it's also illegal to speak positively about gay people in Haiti, right? So of course, if you're living in a country like that, you may be hiding, but that doesn't mean they're not there. There have been no studies that show that there are less gay people in more repressive societies. It's pretty much constant throughout the world, regardless of whether or not your society is accepting, affirming, or openly hostile or dangerous for LGBTQ people. Even in countries where it is illegal to be gay, they still have gay pride parades, right? Jamaica has been like known notorious for being anti-gay, but they have two prides in Jamaica, one in Montego Bay and one in Kingston, right? So we know that people are there, people are living. This is Benjamin Banneker here on the right. Benjamin Banneker was an openly gay man. He was an ex-slave, and he also basically built Washington, D.C. He was the architect for that area. This is from a JSTOR article. Anthropologists hid African same sex relationships. So, sex between people of the same gender has existed for millennia, obviously, but anthropologists in sub Saharan Africa often ignored or distorted those relationships simply because they were uncomfortable. So, again, this is colonial gaze or white gaze. If you come from a Christian environment, in Europe, that wasn't something that they celebrated or were comfortable with. So they just kind of rewrote history as they documented these African relationships, unfortunately. At the bottom here is Alice Walker. Alice Walker is an openly queer writer, the author of The Color Purple. This is another article. I try to include titles of these articles because if you want to continue to look at them, you obviously can. The first drag queen was a former slave who fought for queer freedom a century before Stonewall, right? So in the 1860s, you still had a Black woman or Black trans woman or Black drag queen. We don't know which one, right? Because we can't go back in time and ask people their pronouns, right? But this person was around and was fighting for queer liberation and freedom. It's an excellent article. I strongly recommend it. At the bottom right here, we have Alvin Ailey. Alvin Ailey still has Alvin Ailey Dance Theater. I try to go every February when they come to Miami. And he has a huge dance company now, world renowned and well respected. Unfortunately, he died from complications related to AIDS a few years ago. But that is Alvin Ailey, openly gay man. So this is a documentary called The Day It Snowed in Miami. It came out in 2014. And in this documentary, they were discussing the first time that in modern history that it had snowed in Miami in the 1970s. And on that same day in Miami, they decided that they were no longer going to prevent LGBTQ people from serving in positions of government. And that included things like teachers, right? So they were striking down previous legislation that had banned openly LGBTQ people from serving in positions of government, including teachers. And nobody thought that would ever happen. So it was a big deal that this happened on the same day that it snowed in Miami for the first time, right? That was a huge deal. And so that's why they named the documentary that way. There are very, very, very few Black people in the documentary. And I want to be very specific here that Black and people of color are not synonymous, right? So Black people are people of color, but all people of color are not Black people. So there are plenty of people of color, many Latinx people who are included in this documentary, but there are not many Black people at all, maybe one or two. But this one Black person that they include here, who's shown on the screen, he was fighting for gay rights back in the 70s and 80s. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but he is a heterosexual man. And so it confused me that they didn't have more Black LGBTQ people in this documentary, considering it was dealing with Miami, right, where there are plenty of Black people. And he said at this moment in this documentary, and you can watch it in full on YouTube if you would like, he said in this moment that Black people were selfish for not fighting for LGBTQ rights. And I was very taken aback by that statement. And I was very taken aback simply because they didn't have Black LGBTQ people speaking in this documentary very prominently. So I believe that if they had hired a Black LGBT or if they had allowed a Black LGBTQ person to appear in this documentary, they may have said something different than the fact that Black straight people were selfish, right? Because again, even in that statement, you erase the experiences of Black LGBTQ people who occupy that space at the same time, simultaneously. At the bottom right here, we have Erin Phillips. Oh, she's probably younger than Lil Nas X, but Erin Phillips uses she, her pronouns. She is a Black trans woman. She also is a disability advocate. She has a lot of resources online. She's really, really, really passionate about talking about her experiences, about the plight of people of color, Black people, fighting for the disabled community. So I strongly suggest Googling her. So that's Erin Phillips. So, as we said, Black history is queer history. These things happen at the same time. On the left, we have Stormy Duvalier, And the model in the middle, we have Marsha P. Johnson. On the right, we have Sylvia Rivera. These are three people who were said to be present during the Stonewall riots, fighting back against the cops, fighting back against white supremacy. None of these people are white, right? So Stormé was biracial, was born and raised in Louisiana, and then moved to New York and was doing drag king things. May have been what we describe as non-binary nowadays, kind of in the space in between man and woman. You have Marsha P. Johnson, who was actually photographed by Andy Warhol at one point in her life, a very vocal and very beloved Black trans woman, historical figure throughout the gay rights movement. We have Sylvia Rivera, who crashed the first Pride Parade in 1970. She has this speech called Y'all Better Shut Up, because she had to literally crash and get on stage. And she accused the audience of making gay rights a movement for white middle class people instead of a movement that is inclusive. And she talked about how her experiences as a Puerto Rican trans woman were very different from the experiences of the people who were having that parade, and that they had to make room because they were the ones who were on the front line fighting. It's very powerful. It's on YouTube in its entirety. It has some language, might not be exactly appropriate for kids unless you want to have the you can have a transcript and kind of blank out some of the words, but I strongly suggest viewing that speech. So if we know that some of the queer and trans pioneers of the gay rights movement were Black and brown, if we know that there were affirming people in the civil rights movement at the same time, where did this dichotomy begin, right? So in the upper left-hand corner here, we have Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King Jr. So Bayard Rustin was Martin Luther King's one of his best friends. His kids loved Martin Luther King's kids loved Bayard Rustin because he was always in the house. He was openly gay, openly and unapologetically gay. Martin Luther King was still, he's like, that's my man. I love him. We're great. When Martin Luther King actually was sick and tired of getting threatened and having his children and wife threatened, he decided he was going to go nonviolent. He was going to stop with the nonviolence. And it was Bayard Rustin, who was raised as a Quaker, who told him, please remain nonviolent. It was Bayard Rustin who actually organized the March on Washington, not by himself, but he led that organization. But Bayard Rustin was not allowed on stage to speak. Women were not allowed on stage to speak at the March on Washington. Even white men were allowed to speak, right? Like Bob Dylan got to talk, he got to sing, but they didn't allow Black women to speak. So that's, again, where we see intersectionality here. There was a white politician who wanted to destroy Martin Luther King, as many white people wanted to destroy Martin Luther King back in the day. And he said he was going to spread the rumor that Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin were in a relationship. And so Martin Luther King basically separated himself from Bayard Rustin. The love was still there, the friendship was still there, but he stopped at a certain point appearing in public with him as much. So that's unfortunate. On the right here, we have Huey P. Newton. In 1970, Huey P. Newton delivered a speech titled A Letter to the Revolutionary Brothers and Sisters about the women's liberation and gay liberation movements. He spoke highly of both movements. He called for solidarity. He said, we're all fighting the same patriarchal capitalist system, and we need to be in this struggle together, right? So we see that there's an ally within the Black Panthers. We see that there are openly LGBTQ people. Even Coretta Scott King spoke at Atlanta Pride in the early 90s. We know that the Kings were very supportive and affirming. We know that James Baldwin, who was also very supportive, who was also very active in the civil rights movement, was an openly queer man. Angela Davis was also a Black Panther, was an openly queer woman, right? All back in the 60s and 70s, these things were happening. So what happened? Like when did that stop? Mary Jones of New York. She was called the Man Monster. She was a Black transgender woman born and raised in New Orleans, moved to New York. She was a madam living in New York. And one time she robbed the wrong guy. Most men at the time who were getting robbed by sex workers did not go to the police because then they would have to, implicate themselves as patronizing a sex worker. But this guy was like, I don't care. And so he went to the police anyway, and the police were just taken aback because they thought this is clearly a transgender woman. This has to be a man in a dress, so on and so forth. So she was arrested. And when she was arrested, she was told, you are required to wear the clothing that you were wearing when we arrested you, because of course she was wearing a very feminine dress. And she was like, well, of course I am. When she was put on trial, they asked, why are you dressed like this? And she said, I always have. This is how I've always dressed. This is how I feel. This is who I am. and her name was Mary Jones. And the news just had a ball with this. And there are some historians who say that this is when tabloids began because of this Black trans woman. This is when like sensationalist writing really began, like the gossipy things that we didn't usually print in newspapers because newspapers are very serious and to the point and talked about, presidents and all these respectable things. At the time, they didn't do that, but now they found how salacious it was to write about people like Mary Jones, that took off quite a bit. We have Kathy Williams. Kathy Williams was a Buffalo Soldier who was going by John Williams, quite a bit. And there are many historians who said, oh, she just dressed up like this to get privilege. And I beg to differ. I don't know. I don't know how Kathy or John identified, but we do know that it probably wasn't just for fun or just for privilege. So, yeah, these people existed throughout history, and we have to make sure that we acknowledge their existence and their contributions to both Black history and queer history. There are quite a few articles and books that talk about how the Harlem Renaissance was just as queer as it was Black. Nearly everybody in the Harlem Renaissance was queer. We had Langston Hughes, we had Zora Neale Hurston, we had drag entertainment that was very, very common back in the day during the Harlem Renaissance, and many language arts teachers speak about these events. So it's important to name that these people were openly queer. This is from the Pew Research Center. It was just a question, how do you identify? Do you identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? It was for 18-year-olds and up. And the the oldest person to take it were in their upper 70s. And when the person answered yes, they looked at the demographic responses of these people. So they found that women were more likely than men to be LGBTQ by a little bit. They also found that Black, Hispanic, and Asian people were more likely to be LGBTQ than white people. Right. So where does this myth that there's more homophobia within Black communities come from? Right. Like, where did that come from? How did that come about? They also found that there were more LGBTQ people who were young, between the ages of 18 and 36, than there were in the upwards area. And I want to talk a little bit about that, right? So, what we have to consider is that Caitlyn Jenner, for example, a transgender woman, she said she knew she was a girl when she was 9 years old, and she also knew she couldn't talk about it, right? So, she didn't transition until she was in her late 60s. Right. So there was a lot of living that went in between that and a lot of decision making. And she had tried several times throughout her life to transition, but she just didn't feel safe. She didn't know what to do. She was in the public eye. She was an athlete, so it was just difficult for her, So there are a number of people who probably would have identified as LGBTQ had they had the language and had they had the safety to do so. Additionally, HIV and AIDS is not by any means a gay disease. However, it really, really affected the gay community back in the 80s and 90s. And a number of those people would have been in their 50s and 70s today and just are no longer here with us. Right? So that's how we see that happen. It's not that kids are getting gayer and gayer. It's that people are just living their lives. They're having language and they have the safety to identify the way they want to. So I don't think that this skew is as large as it looks here. Next, annual household income. So it looks here that all the people who don't make money are gay, and that's not exactly what we're seeing here. What we're seeing here is systemic oppression, right? So when you are openly LGBTQ, when you are transgender, when you are gender nonconforming, you are less likely to have steady employment. You are less likely to find a well-paying job, and that's not because of any other reason than homophobia and transphobia. So we have to name that, right? I know plenty of queer and trans people with these upper level degrees that can't find jobs for no other reason than the homophobia and transphobia that exist in their workplace, particularly in education. It's still a stigma for openly LGBTQ educators to be in education. And we know where we fall in that income line, right? So that's how that happens. And even less likely for LGBTQ people to be promoted as they come into education. We already talked about Billie Holiday. So when did the dichotomy begin, right? Um, this is also Alice Dunbar Neeson. Alice Dunbar Neeson was a biracial, bisexual poet who lived in the 1800s, and she transcribed her romantic feelings for multiple genders back in the 1800s, right? So that's great. We should read some of her poems. But when did this all separate, as I've been asking? This is Frequency, a BYP 100 organizer. BYP is doing some amazing work. There's a lot of respectability politics in general in the Black community, they say. A lot of poverty shaming, a lot of slut shaming. It just naturally happens because the Black community has for so long been in a struggle for survival and for so long had to choose the best representative in order to shine for us. Right. So that's a quote about how respectability affects communities. And again, this is not just Black communities, this is any community in which you are oppressed, right? We can see this show up in the disabled community. You know, people want disability to look a certain way, or people prefer invisible disabilities, and so on and so forth. This shows up in the gay community as well, right? There's this pressure to perform in a heteronormative way, even if you are gay. So this shows up a lot. And if you are Black and LGBTQ, you are especially pressured to look a certain way, act a certain way, behave a certain way. And there are certain histories that are buried and that are hard to get to. That being George Washington Carver, who was rumored to be gay. There's rumors that he would hold hands with a man, kiss a man, was reportedly living with a man. It's also reported that he was living with a white family when he was a child. And because they didn't want him to sexually assault their white daughter, they had him castrated. And there are certain people who say that we're conflating that castration with him being gay and so on and so forth. So it's really hard to find like credible sources around like how he felt. And again, still because people thought it was his business or shameful, there's some people who just rewrite the histories of individuals. So I put him here. The jury is still out with George Washington Carver. This is a quote from James Baldwin, who was also discussing the intersection of race and LGBTQ identity. He said, I think white gay people feel cheated because they were born, in principle, in a society in which they were supposed to be safe. The anomaly of their sexuality puts them in danger unexpectedly. Their reaction seems to me in direct proportion to their sense of feeling cheated of the advantages with which accrue to white people in a white society. There's an element, it has always seemed to me, of bewilderment and complaint. Now, that may sound very harsh, but the gay world as such is no more prepared to accept Black people than anywhere else in society. He said this in 1984 when asked about Black LGBTQ people. So there's an image of a person hanging on the next slide. As I'm recording this, I've just been informed that little Richard passed away. So I, of course, wanted to put my Black queer ancestor on this presentation. So that's little Richard, kind of looks like Patti LaBelle a little bit if you look at it fast in this picture. Right. So on the left, there was a civil rights movement in which Black men were walking down the street saying, holding signs that say, I am a man, meaning, why do I, as a Black man, not get the same advantages that accrue to white men? Why am I not seen as a full man? Which, you know, they could have used different language. They could have said, you know, I'm a human being or something like that, but whatever. They said, I am a man, right? So there's truth to this. There's truth to Black people never owning their gender, never being seen, never being allowed to own their gender, never being seen as having the same gender, right? Even during the women's rights movements, when they were fighting for the right to vote, they were talking about white women. They had no issue with Black women not having the right to vote, and that's well documented. That wasn't something that they were trying to do, right? So Black women and Black men have never even had agency over their gender in a racist society. In the middle here, this comes from a postcard that was saying that Black slaves were the best to use in the fields because Black women basically didn't need what we would call maternity leave today. It was said that they could just suckle over their shoulders. They could just throw their breasts back and suckle over their shoulders, almost like an animal. And so they didn't need rest, right? They weren't the same type of woman as women are, as white women are. And of course, there's this picture of this hanging person, unfortunately. And I've seen a lot of lynching pictures where people had their pants down. I worked in the Black archives when I was at Florida A&M University, and I was documenting lynchings, which was terrible work. My professor asked me to do it, though. And I saw, you know, that they were have their pants down. And when I read into this, it turns out that They would actually cut off the genitals of people who were lynched. And it wasn't always genitals. Sometimes it was ears or noses, and other body parts. And they would pickle them and jar them, and like keep them on their mantle at these lynching parties. And it was all celebratory. And they play music and they'd be excited as they auctioned off these body parts of these Black people, right? So there's been this lack of agency over our bodies as well, over our sexuality when we were called breeders, so on and so forth. So Black people have never had the opportunity to own their gender identity, their sexuality, in the same way that white people have throughout history. And there's a certain trauma there that we have about that. And I think also a certain resentment that we see white LGBTQ people getting a lot of rights very rapidly in ways that Black people are still fighting, right? So there's historical trauma here to consider. So, intergenerational trauma or transgenerational trauma is traumatic stress passed down generations as a result of traumatic events suffered by older generations, oftentimes leading to long term physical and mental health disorders, right? So, when we talk about generational trauma, the mitochondrial DNA that created me existed within my grandmother, right, before my mom was born. So, if my grandmother, who's still alive, she's turning 96 this year, was born in 1924, the trauma that she experienced quite literally rewrites your DNA. And that trauma went into my mother, and that her trauma went into me, right? So all of those things are passed down. Stress is passed down throughout the body. It's not something that you just have to speak, right? And there's a trauma that we have around sexuality, around gender, around our bodies that we have to acknowledge. In the bottom here, we have Angela Davis. We already talked about her. So this is something that happened in Haiti recently. So unfortunately, there was the Haitian earthquake about a decade ago, and Pat Robertson, an evangelical person, said that the earthquake was a blessing in disguise, and said that the Haitians deserved this to happen because they were using voodoo and had sold their souls to the devil, which is just abhorrent. I mean, that's one of the worst things that you can say about a group of people, because there was so much death and devastation as a result of this earthquake. Um, and when he said that, there was this organization called Courage in Haiti, which Courage means courage in Haitian Creole. And it was an LGBTQ center. That's why they have the pink triangle. If you don't know about the pink triangle, it's a symbolism. You can look it up. But Courage was in the same place for many years. But after Pat Robertson said that, after he basically shamed Haitians and said that it was sin that caused the earthquake, Courage began to get attacked. And it was very strange. Some leaders of Courage were killed, some openly gay people who were enjoying their life, beforehand. After the earthquake, it was like people began to internalize that sin brought upon death and devastation. And so Courage became like the scapegoat, unfortunately, and they had to change their address many times because they continued to be attacked, unfortunately. So, again, for that man who told me there were no gay people in Haiti, obviously there are. There's an entire LGBTQ center in Haiti. This is a map of places where there are laws that outlaw LGBTQ identities, basically. And as you can tell from this map, where these places are, the different colors are saying that there are different types of laws, different varying degrees of the laws. Some places where it's illegal for men, but legal for women. Some people it's illegal for everybody. Some people it's illegal and punishable by a fine. Some places it's illegal and punishable by death. It's all over the place, but we can see where those countries are concentrated. And of course, for a few countries, we didn't have the data available. So what do these countries have in common? At the bottom here is Deshaun L. Harrison. He uses he, him pronouns. He's a non-binary writer. He has a website of all of his writings, and he talks about being at the intersection of fat phobia, homophobia, transphobia, and racism all at once. Great writings. So obviously these countries have in common that they come from the most melanated nations, right? So the darkest skinned people are where we see most of the anti-LGBTQ laws. And most people take that at face value and run, right? So they say things like, oh, well, Africa as a continent must be homophobic, and just go on with that because so many countries in Africa were lit up with these colors, right? And a couple of countries also in South America it was, and the darker areas of Asia as well. But if you take this from a historical standpoint, this is the ruler Kamehameha in the upper left-hand corner here. And Kamehameha was a one of the first rulers of Hawaii. And when Captain Cook came and tried to colonize Hawaii, Captain Cook and all of his soldiers were very offended by the fact that Kamehameha was Mahu, a term that indigenous Hawaiians use for people who have both the masculine and feminine spirit, kind of what we would call trans or non-binary, but what they call Mahu, and it is its own word in its own right by itself. And they were very disgusted by the queerness, by the same-sex relations that they witnessed, and the fact that they weren't ashamed. That was what they wrote about. They were like, not only are they gay, they're proud. Like they just couldn't stand it. They couldn't handle it. Here in the middle is King Nzinga of what is now Angola, before the colonization of Angola. In the 1500s, King Nzinga, who went by king, not queen, because there was a word for queen, and Nzinga wanted to go by king, fought the Portuguese colonizers off with their army. We don't know, and we don't know Nzinga's pronouns, so I just say they fought the Portuguese army off, which was a huge feat in the 1500s for people who had like access to gunpowder, and King Nzinga did not. King Nzinga was also noted to wear very masculine clothing that was traditionally worn by masculine people or men. And Nzinga had like a group of 30 different girlfriends who were all trans women. So I had all of these like gender nonconforming girlfriends. So King Nzinga is pretty amazing. You should look them up. We also have Wewa. Wewa, the Zuni tribe in the United States. Wewa was two spirit. So a word again similar, embodying both the masculine and feminine within yourself, or the masculine and feminine energy within yourself. So Wewa actually met with President Grover Cleveland at the time to speak on behalf of her tribe. She used she, her pronouns. And Grover Cleveland was so impressed with her and he thought she was great. And he was like, hey, we should respect these Zuni tribe members and these indigenous people more often. And then all of a sudden he was like, never mind, once he found out that she was two spirit. These are the Hijra of India. And in India, one of the dominant religions is Hinduism and also Islam. But in Hinduism, there are many different gods, and sometimes God shows up with no gender. Sometimes God shows up with two genders at the same time. Sometimes God's gender is fluid, showing up as masculine and feminine at different times in different ways. And so, for people who identified as having fluid genders or more than one gender, that was pretty unstigmatized back in the day in India. They were like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Just like that one God, you know, that makes sense to me. And so Hijra people at the time were not necessarily looked down upon. It wasn't until British colonization in the 1800s when being Hijra became illegal, right? It wasn't until in Hawaii when the when Hawaii was colonized that being Mahu became illegal, right? It wasn't until Nzinga, Angola was colonized by the Portuguese that these things became illegal. So there is a direct correlation between colonization, particularly Christian colonization, that caused the downfall of these very queer and trans friendly societies. So, what becomes of a people who have been denied their history and their ancestral knowledge that could be both affirming and directive? This is Danez Smith. Danez Smith is a poetry writer, has won many awards for their books. Great writer. So, LGBTQ students of color experience increased surveillance and policing, higher incidence of harsh school discipline, and biased application of policies, right? So, things like dress code are unfairly brought upon Black girls who are cisgender and also Black, queer, and transgender nonconforming children. They're often blamed for their own victimization, saying things like, well, if you didn't act like that, or if you just changed how you behave, then you wouldn't be in trouble. And they're told this by both administration sometimes, and unfortunately, sometimes their own parents and communities, and they find themselves ignored by both people of color communities and LGBTQ communities. So, in other words, and this is data from GLSEN. So, in other words, Black LGBTQ children who need to have their needs met, they may be told by organizations that specifically work with Black people, well, you should take that to LGBTQ spaces, right? That's where you'll be welcomed and affirmed. And then LGBTQ spaces that are often dominated by white people may say, well, if that's a Black issue, you should take it to the Black place. right? So they're denied services, help, and affirmation in both cities. So where does that leave them, right? What then becomes of them? This is the Black, Gay, and Lesbian Leadership Forum that took place in the early 1990s. So, what becomes of a child who is taught either through explicit instruction or omission, right? Because regardless of your intent, if you do it by omission or if you're just openly hostile, what becomes of them? If they're taught they come from no one, no place, and nothing, right? If they are taught that they do not have history, what becomes of that child? This is Pennell. Pennell is a Black trans boy. He has a YouTube story about his life called Mom, I'm Not a Girl, when he came out to his mom as a very young child. There's a Junot Diaz quote. Um, Junot said, "You guys know about vampires? You know, vampires have no reflections in a mirror. There's this idea that monsters don't have reflections in a mirror. And what I've always thought isn't that monsters don't have reflections in a mirror, it's that if you want to make a human being into a monster, deny them at the cultural level any reflection of themselves. And growing up, I felt like a monster in some ways. I didn't see myself reflected at all. I was like, yo, is something wrong with me? That the whole society seems to think that people like me don't exist. And part of what inspired me was this deep desire that before I died, I would make a couple of mirrors, that I would make some mirrors so that kids like me might see themselves reflected back and might not feel so monstrous for it." This is Moms Mabley. Moms Mabley was a comedian and was also an openly Black queer woman. This is another quote from Blake Brockington. "I've had people call me a tranny, a dyke. I've had people call me he, she, it thing. You know, they called me homecoming thing and called me a pervert and an abomination. Different things. I've gotten a lot of different things." Bonus question: what becomes of an educator who has no knowledge of the diverse lived experiences of Black people? This is Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, was also an openly queer woman. This is a quote from a student from a study on LGBTQ youth in the school to prison pipeline. "The teachers, they thought we were selling weed in school. They thought that me and her were both selling weed because, like, the way we were dressing, because we were the only girls at that middle school that dressed like boys. So it was like, now we're bad." 1 in 5 young people in juvenile justice facilities identifies as LGBTQ. 85% of those are youth of color. So there is a correlation, right, between being at the intersection of racism, homophobia, transphobia that's leading children, our kids, into the juvenile justice system at disproportionate rates. There is one study, and it's here, that found that nearly 40% of girls in juvenile justice facilities across the United States are LGB, lesbian, gay, or bisexual. 40%. That is ridiculous, right? 3.2% of boys, they say, which I believe is underreported. But I could also understand why a boy in a juvenile justice facility would not want to come out, regardless of whether a study is um, um, using their name or not. Of all youth in juvenile justice facilities, about 20%, and of all youth nationwide, 7.9%. All right, so we can see that jump. This is LGB youth who report, LGB youth report higher rates of sexual contact with staff. So LGB youth are saying 15% of boys are saying that they're experiencing sexual contact with staff, and 4.6% of girls say that they are. While heterosexual youth, 8.9% of boys are reporting sexual contact with staff and 2.2% of girls. So there's something going on in juvenile justice facilities systemically. This is nationwide. There's something going on where adults are having inappropriate contact with students. And this is what happens when you throw people away, right? And this is what happens when we don't consider the needs of people who are suffering from incarceration. LGB youth report high rates of peer sexual assault as well. Boys are saying that they're also being sexually assaulted at extremely high rates, who are LGB, while heterosexual youth are still are reporting sexual assault, but at much lower rates. And of course, this should be zero across the board. All of these should be zero, regardless of LGB or heterosexual. So it's quite disturbing. So we talked about intersectionality tool, which is intersectionality as an analysis tool to understand legalized oppression. This is a collage of all of the transgender people, just people, who were killed in 2019. And there have been already, I believe, 11 transgender people killed as of early May of 2020. Right, so we're on a trend for the rest of the year. Despite COVID, despite the fact that people are supposed to be indoors, we're still finding that trans people of color are being killed. And as you can see, this is disproportionately affecting trans Black women, trans Latinx women, and trans women in general. There's only like one man here, right? One transgender man here. So this is a huge issue. This is what happens when we are not taking care of a vulnerable group of people, right? When society throws this group away. And oftentimes when these people are killed, there are not arrests, there are not people who go after the killers with a sense of urgency, a sense of care. They rarely make the news, right? And their lives rarely make the news before that, right? If the only time you make the news is when you're killed, that's not going to have a good psychological impact on LGBTQ children if their only introduction to Black trans women is their murders. So how do we affirm the experience of Black and Afro-Caribbean youth who are queer and trans? What happens if we don't? And of course, I had to put Whitney here. The first time I presented on this topic, Whitney's best friend, ex-girlfriend, had first come out and said that they had had a relationship. So I felt the need to honor our good sis. Plus, I love Whitney Houston. So number one, cater to the Black imagination. There's this scholar who says that Black children don't get to have imagination because of the way in which they are portrayed on television and in media, in music videos, and so on and so forth. They don't get to see something else for themselves. They don't get to see the diversity of experience. The first time I really saw the diversity experience of Black people that was celebrated was when I went to a historically Black school. You know, at HBCU, where everybody's Black. You had the Black anime kids, you had the Black jocks, you had the Black mean girls, you had like all of the groups that you had, just everybody was Black. And we have to show our students a diverse collection experience of Black people, culturally relevant LGBTQ curriculum and resources, and make it local, right? Find out who the Black LGBTQ people are who are making waves in your community. Confront homophobic and transphobic slurs and establish that early. Be a visible ally. You can put up posters, stickers, flags, pictures of LGBTQ people and name them and celebrate them before you're ever asked to. You can celebrate Black, Queer, and Trans History Month. What month is that? Every month. It's every day. Just do it all the time. And lastly, become more aware of your own privileges to understand that challenging systems of oppression cannot be done without sacrifice. My mentor told me that, Lutsi Segu. She said that we cannot upend these systems of oppression without giving up something, without sacrificing something of our own. And that sacrifices some privilege that we've enjoyed that we did not deserve, right? Because privilege is like the gift that you didn't deserve and never asked for. But once you have that gift, you might as well do something with it, right? At the bottom here, we have Jean-Michel Basquiat, the artist, the painter, who is half Haitian, half Latinx, and openly queer. So center the needs and experiences of Black and Afro-Caribbean children, right? Inclusive design benefits everyone. So this is Big Frida, who's amazing. Inclusive design is the theory that if you are designing something to be inclusive for a small group of people, that it inadvertently benefits everyone, right? So like the invention of sidewalks were created for wheelchair users, but now everyone uses sidewalks. Children play on sidewalks, they don't play in the street. I walk my dog on a sidewalk. When I'm getting groceries in the car from Target, I'm using a sidewalk. Everything that we do, right, is using sidewalks. And when I'm in a place that doesn't have sidewalks, I immediately notice and I'm like, what's going on? Why doesn't this place have sidewalks? Because they're beneficial to everyone, not just wheelchair users, people with strollers and everything else, right? So that's inclusive design. So if you're centering the needs of one of the most vulnerable populations in your classroom, that's beneficial to everyone, right? So the cisgender heterosexual children in your classroom are not being robbed of an experience by learning the diverse history of Black LGBTQ people. So we cannot close the opportunity gap without empowering queer and trans students of color, because queer and trans students of color are more likely to be pushed out of school. They're more likely to end up in DJJ. They're more likely to drop out of school because of the oppression that they experience in school, because their clothing is over-policed, because their experiences are over-policed, because their mannerisms are over-policed. They're pushed out of school. So if you want to see a change in grades and test scores, then you need to make sure that you're nurturing all students. Use your privilege to influence the hiring of people of color who are LGBTQ. Use your privilege to find funding for initiatives that are queer and Black specific. And find your district school inclusive policies, LGBTQ inclusive policies, and post them widely and talk about them widely. So this is the last thing that Blake Brockington said before he took his life, unfortunately, at the age of 19. He said, "I'm so exhausted." It's what he posted on his Tumblr page. His friends and his girlfriend at the time said that he had been spiraling for a while, dealing with a lot of depression. When he did come out as Homecoming King, unlike Nigel Shelby that we talked about, he did not have a supportive family. He actually had to go live with other people, teachers and friends. He was couch surfing. After coming out as a transgender boy, he went other places because he didn't feel safe at home. His parents didn't understand who he was. They didn't try to understand who he was, unfortunately. And so he had to leave. So without the support of his family, even though he got into college, he was doing well. He just was going through too much at the time, and he took his own life. This is him posing in his fight for Black Lives Matter. He was a huge part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Two of the three women who coined the term Black Lives Matter were actually openly queer women as well. He said, "I have the right to be alive. I am not a criminal." And he's wearing a shirt with the names of Black men who were killed by vigilantes and the police, right? So this is something that he was fighting for constantly. He said it was a lot. It was a lot to fight both as a Black person and as a trans person, right? So we have to keep that in mind, what that does to children if we don't celebrate them in the right way. This is from writer Deshaun Harrison. He said, "To be visibly queer is to choose your happiness over your safety." However, Afro-Caribbean and non-binary actor and activist India Moore reminds us, existence that requires bravery is not freedom. A life that requires bravery is not free, right? So even though it's very brave, and sometimes we tell like Black LGBTQ kids, it's very brave for you to come out, that's not free. That's not living, right? We don't want them to just survive. We want them to thrive. So thank you for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, this is how you can contact me.